A while ago, 2 weeks ago, I gave a talk at our men's Tuesday morning Bible study, and then afterwards, a number of the men came up to me and said, Vic, you ought to give that talk on a Sunday morning. My hesitation was, and still is somewhat, that it's quite personal, and parts of it are quite painful. 2010 was the most difficult year of my life. I'm going to walk through some of the events that took place since last August in my life and those of the people I love, backwards, going in reverse order. The week before Christmas, our beloved 13-year-old chocolate lab Carolina died in my arms, was hit by a car in front of our house, and so we said goodbye to a dog that has been a big part of our life for the past 13 years. So you've been to our house and seen our dog Carolina. There's something strangely healing about just picking up the bulk of my dog from the street and carrying her to the car and taking her down to be cremated. But of course, a dog is a dog and doesn't register on the scale of human beings. And 2 days after that, my Uncle John, whom I've spoken of in sermons, who was my role model as a boy in ministry, was a missionary to Central America, passed away finally from cancer in Irvine, California. And then 2 weeks before that, my wife Becky got out of the hospital where she had been this past year in two-week stints in Denver at National Jewish Hospital for a lung infection that is a result of her adult onset cystic fibrosis. Now, Becky lives a very active life, but this is a lingering, continuing issue for her. But all of that is dwarfed by magnitude by what happened to my 28-year-old nephew, Brandon, who was killed last August. Very, very freakish thing. He was lying in the back of a pickup truck that was parked in a friend's driveway. It was on a slant, and he had his head down in the bed of the truck, talking on a cell phone with his head downhill, and he stood up quickly and continued to talk on the cell phone, jumped off the back of the pickup, and somehow fainted, pitched forward, hit his head, and after a week in a coma, he died. I could not wait to get out of 2010. And perhaps you too had your own nightmarish year with things like family sadnesses and financial struggles or health issues. So that when someone says to you, well, how was your last year? You might be tempted to say, it was miserable. It was terrible. I wish it had never happened. But here's something that we must consider, and that is that God has a different set of criteria for measuring a good year than we do. Here are some questions we should ask ourselves from a divine perspective. Did I grow deeper in my walk with God during the past year? Did I increase my knowledge of God in the past year? Did I strengthen my relationship and ties with the family of God in the last year? Did I grow in giving myself away to others? In other words, what you see here is from a divine perspective, you could have a wildly successful year in the midst of miserable circumstances. And one thing that life pounds into us eventually is that God runs with a different agenda than do we. You can tell a lot about people by how they plan their travel. I'm one of those people who goes online and I weeks and months in advance, and I'll figure out what hotel we're going to be in, what events we're going to go see, and I'll do research on the best restaurants and that sort of thing. And, if you're online, you can actually figure out how many miles it is between gas stations, stuff like that. I am on the Myers-Briggs personality test. I'm a high J, which means I'm a planner. But, there are lots of people who are exactly the opposite. I mean, I know people who do stuff like throw a few things in a bag, and they'll get out, get in the car, in the driveway, look at each other and say, okay, now which way should we drive? And then on the way out of town, they'll stop at a mini market and pick up a toothbrush. And away they go, in the words of the rock group The Who, like air-conditioned gypsies. And believe it or not, that, friend, is the model for the Christian life. It's going not knowing on a journey without maps, so that I believe what God is calling us to as we look forward to 2011 is that we would have a hobo's heart where we have faith that even the wrong roads can lead us to the right place. And that our theme verse would be, and you don't need to look this up, it's very brief, but you can if you want. It's Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, and here are the words. Trust in the Lord, and this was our anthem this morning. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. You know, Jesus said to those fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, he just walked up and said, follow me. And it says they left their nets and followed. You talk about having a hobo's heart. Where he leads, I will follow. There are many times in life where we find ourselves, we just don't know where we are. We don't know why we're there. I will gaze into my crystal ball right now and into your future. And I will say that in the next few months, there will come a moment where you look around and go, where am I? How did I get here? I must have taken a wrong turn back there somewhere. This is the last place I ever thought I'd be. And about that time, you might hear a chuckle from heaven. And I pray that you would say, Lord, give me a hobo's heart. Most of us were raised on a very different philosophy, and that is the philosophy of Robert Frost in that wonderful poem, The Road Not Taken. Remember that poem we learned when we were younger? Robert Frost looks back at a crossroads in his life, and he said, 2 roads diverged into a wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And yet, I talk to people, and it's a good poem if it, encourages us to pray and ask for God's guidance. But I know people who, when you talk to them, they say, well, listen, I took the wrong road years ago. And because I did that, now I have to live with plan B for the rest of my life because of this decision I made back when I was young and foolish. Oh, friend, if that's you this morning, I hope that God gives you a hobo's heart. Because if there's anything true in the Christian life, it's a truism that wrong roads can lead us to the right place. Look at Jonah. Here's Jonah, who's called by God to go and preach the word in Nineveh. So what does Jonah do? He hot-foots it the exact opposite direction, off toward Tarshish. What does God do? God grabs him, carries him kicking and screaming, and deposits him right where he belongs in Nineveh. Or there was a young gangly teenager named David who was told by his father to carry some cheeses to his brothers who are fighting in a war. Who would ever believe that on that road, David discovers his destiny is to be the great king of Israel? Or think of the Apostle Paul, whose great dream was to preach the gospel in Spain. If you were here last week, you heard instead God had him be a prisoner in Rome. And then, of course, there's the most famous wrong turn in all of history, the Israelites. Remember, they zigged and zagged for 40 years in the wilderness before finally arriving at that place, which was their promised land. It seems like every Bible character can say something like, a funny thing happened to me on the way to blank. It almost seems like everybody who gets to the right place in Scripture spends some time on the wrong road. Henry Durant was a banker in Switzerland in the 19th century. He was very wealthy, and he was sent by the Swiss government to make a business deal with Napoleon in Paris. Only when Henry Durant arrived in Paris, he found that Napoleon was off fighting a war against the Austrians in Solferino, Italy. And so he got back in his carriage, he giddy up his horses down to Solferino, Italy. And Henry Durant happened to arrive at the precise moment when he could hear the bugles blast, and there was the thundering charge of battle. He had never seen the terrible, ghastly carnage of war before. And Henry Durant stood there and he watched in absolute horror as he saw cannonballs tear through human flesh, saw acres of wounded and dying men. He was so moved by that experience that he stayed there. He didn't go home. For several weeks, that he helped the doctors minister to the wounded men who were in the churches and the nearby farmhouses. Even when he got back to Switzerland, eventually, he could not keep his mind on his banking business. He was so just obsessed with what he experienced down in Italy. In fact, he lost focus so much that he lost his fortune. He went bankrupt. And even in all of those struggles right then in his life, he never lost the sense that God was sovereign in his life. And here's what he said. He said, I was aware of an intuition, vague yet profound, that this was God's will. It seemed to me that I had something to accomplish as a sacred duty, and that it was destined to have fruits of infinite consequence for mankind. Well, you can say that again, because out of his depression and his failure, Henry Durant founded the International Red Cross in Switzerland, which has saved millions and millions of lives in disasters and war. And it won Henry Durant the very first Nobel Peace Prize. And it's all because he was on the wrong road that led him to Italy and to failure and bankruptcy. I have a handicapped friend. He loves to say this. He says, a setback is just a setup for a comeback. Isn't that great? A setback is simply a setup for a comeback. You say, yeah, but I've been on this road, this wrong road for a long time. I mean, it's not just the place I'm in, it's the pace I'm traveling. I mean, I'm not making much progress. Well, you know, one way to learn the ways of God is to see how God deals with the children of Israel. That's what's so great about the Old Testament. I'm going to read you a portion of Numbers chapter 9, and I want you to listen carefully and see if somehow you can perceive a profound lesson in these words. Listen, on the day the tabernacle, of the tent of the testimony was set up, the cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. That is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command, they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in the camp. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp. And then at his command, they would set out. Is this starting to sink in yet? Sometimes the cloud stayed from only evening till morning, and then it lifted in the morning, and they set out. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for a few days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out, but when it lifted, they would set out. At the Lord's command, they encamped, and the Lord's command, they set out. Get it? A hobo is in no particular hurry to get to any particular place at any particular time. You see, our pace, our timing is all up to God. Listen again to the fine print. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In other words, God says to us, the price of this deal where I get you where you belong in the right place is this. Trust me. Trust me. I have to say my chocolate lab, Carolina, was the most trusting creature I've ever known. My chocolate lab, Carolina, was so trusting that she, and maybe your dog does this too, but would position herself in the house on the most traveled path in a doorway and then roll on her back like this. First of all, trusting that no one's going to step on her, and in hopes that somebody will come along and reach down and just rub her tummy. I think one of the questions to ask ourselves is, do we trust our master as much as our dogs trust us? I have a friend who says God gave his dogs to teach us the gospel. You can't be a Christian without trust. I mean, what was salvation for Adam and Eve? Did God say, now you got to pick 18 apples a day in order to be right with me? No, what God said was, you may eat of all the fruit in the garden except for the fruit of that tree. You've got to trust that I know what's best for you better than you do yourself. Lean not on your own understanding. We go forward with a creative and brilliant God who is able to turn our mistakes into magic. And he can pull beauty out of our blunders. One of the things I've often said, sort of tongue-in-cheek through the years, I've said to younger people, I said, you can't make a mistake before you're 40. Everything up to 40 is just experience. Because even on a wrong road, if you trust God, he is going to lead you to the right place. I have a friend who always signs his letters, and I love this. He signs his letters in his grip. In his grip. And that's how you and I live going forward, in the grip, in the loving hand of our God. Trusting that even the wrong road can lead us to the right place. Some of us may be dreading what's out ahead. David has this moment where he's terrified of all the enemies that he knows are lying in wait for him, and he's paralyzed. He can't move forward. And then he prays this in Psalm 59. He prays, "Oh Lord, you go before me." You're already out there, God. You're around the bend, and you're arranging circumstances for my blessing and for my growth. I have a lifelong friend who, for me, lives this life of trusting God, perhaps more than anyone I know. He's very different from me. He is brilliant. He is creative and artistic. He's also borderline schizophrenic, and at times he's suicidal. And he knows that if he trusts and leans on his own understanding, his fragile grasp of reality could do him in. And one of the ways he's been able to trust has been a piece of paper that he began putting above his desk when he was in college. The amazing words of the great Roman Catholic Cardinal John Henry Newman, words that have been meant so much to me through my years as well. Listen to these words. Wherever I am, I can never be thrown away. If I am in sickness, my sickness may serve him. In perplexity, my perplexity may serve him. If I am in sorrow, my sorrow may serve him. My sickness, my perplexity, or sorrow may be necessary causes of some greater end which is beyond me. He does nothing in vain. He may prolong my life, he may shorten it. He knows what he is about. He may take away my friends. He may throw me among strangers. He may make me feel desolate, make my spirit sick, hide my future from me. Still, he knows what he is about. I ask not to see. I ask not to know. I ask simply to be used. Even when we don't see, even when we don't know, even when we feel lost, we can trust that somehow we are being used. I know that's true of my family since the death of my nephew Brandon in August. This event, so tragic, that's beyond the grasp of any of our understanding. Nonetheless, we can see every day ways that God is using this terrible thing to bring him glory. Just under 2,000 people at the gathering. And afterwards, a young Muslim college student accepted Jesus Christ. There were numbers of people who recommitted their life to Jesus Christ. There was a young police officer who attended, who 2 months later was tragically shot and killed in the line of duty. His family was trying to make some connection with the Christian faith that they couldn't find in his life, except for one thing, that he had been at the service and he had come home and talked enthusiastically about what he experienced at this service. And so the family requested this very church would host the memorial for this fallen police officer. And there were 5,000 people who came to that, including they had semi-trucks with jumbotrons out in the parking lot. All of that as a result of Brandon passing away. Brandon's Facebook is still active, and young adults almost every day go on and they write notes to him.